Welcome to the fourth part of our series on learning how to deliver value through IT. Today we're going to be talking about all things as a service, or anything as a service. We've got some special guests here to walk us through that today. With us today, Stephen Jenkins, Senior Director of the Intelligent Technology Solutions at Diversified. Zach Duncan, our IT subject matter expert on the federal team within Diversified, and Gina Ringgenberg, Vice President of Federal Finance, Key Bank. And I'm Nathan Jones, Director of Sales. I'll be serving as your moderator today. Through the call, we're going to cover a couple of things here. Zach's going to lead us in a conversation around the issues with IT procurement and some background on Diversified. Stephen will then discuss how Diversified approaches anything as a service and talk about some of the examples there. And we'll round out the call with Gina discussing how to make this a financial reality specific to the federal government. You're welcome to put in questions throughout the call. Please use the chat session or the Q&A session. When you do that, please address it to all panelists. As the panelists are speaking, they may or may not be able to keep up with the questions. I'm going to be tracking those as we go. We'll pause throughout the call here and open up the mics and for live questions, and I'll gather any that come along through the call, and I'll read those out as well, so we'll make sure we get everyone's questions covered. Before we get going, I'll pause here and say, are there any questions? Feel free to unmute and jump in and ask away. If not, I'm going to pass the mic over to Zach to give us an overview.
All right, thanks, Nathan. Thanks for being here to moderate for all four parts of this series, and a special shout out to the people behind the scenes, Lisa and Tammy from our marketing department. We really appreciate all the effort that you put into this, because we know how it is wrangling people together and doing this 4 weeks in a row, so thank you. And if you have joined us for all parts of this series, kudos to you. If you haven't, I'd like to say that, we just aren't on here touting the new products or how fast the new switch is. We're actually targeting solutions that directly address federal mandates or trends that we see across IT to simplify your life, make day-to-day management easier, and as we hit on last week and this week, how to streamline the procurement process. So a quick Diversified overview. You can see we were founded in '93, over 1,500 employees. 75% of our employees are technical professionals. And one of the big ones that we should hit on for this webinar is our 3 network operation centers that monitor over 300,000 endpoints. So when you're talking about as a service and the ability to service infrastructure after the sale, those are 2 big things to hit on. And Diversified is really seen as a systems integrator. We are not just a VAR. So that's why we're so good at this and why we think the as a service model is right up our alley. Nationwide support. As you can see, no matter where you are in the country, we have a relatively local office to you. We also have an office in South Korea, and we're expanding internationally over the next few years. Certified for Success, we have a ton of manufacturer certification as well as, managed service certification. So, not only are we relevant with the vendors, but the install and best practices around that, we are great. Contract vehicles. If you're not a federal government customer, as I've said on the previous webinars, this may not apply to you, but for our Fed customers that are on this call, we understand the need for small business or specialized contracts, and we have the ability to do that. And we also are part of a mentor protege program with the Small Business Administration. So we recently brought on an 8A Alaskan Native company called Eagle Harbor, who we will be mentoring and helping them grow within the federal business. So that's another avenue we have to jump through those procurement hoops. Divisions, Diversified calls it the 4 walls in philosophy. We have a ton of business units that can fit all your needs. So think of if you have a new building, we could do the structured cabling, we can do the video endpoints, your conference rooms, we can do the IT infrastructure, the electronic security solutions, digital media group for digital signage, and, you know, we have a global services team that manages those endpoints, as I referenced before. So there's really nothing that we can't do for you across the enterprise to fulfill your needs. All right, so if you were listening last week, we talked about streamlining the license procurement process, specifically with Cisco enterprise agreements. Today, we're talking about the problems with IT procurement. At least these are my opinions and opinions I've seen across the industry. So the problem with IT procurement and why people are looking to change it. IT is often seen as the slowest moving business unit within the enterprise. You have to integrate with legacy systems. You have to get the equipment, put it in a test dev environment, make sure everything is going to work before you put it into production. You have to ensure that it integrates with the legacy equipment or the cloud if you're now moving to that, and that takes a long time. So you outlay this initial investment of capital expenditures. Oftentimes, IT infrastructure equipment is very expensive, and you don't see a return on your investment until much, much later. And the second point I just hit on, the initial outlay of cash and the time it takes to implement, the ROI is not realized. Another thing I want to mention is CIOs are tasked with managing disparate systems from a multitude of vendors. Imagine if someone else was able to do that for you and provide your infrastructure as a service. And then a big one on here, the lack of adequate technical staff to keep up with the pace of change as technology becomes more and more burdensome or more new, okay? Software-defined networking, programmability, integrated with CLI now, move to the cloud. All of these things provide a new skill set. And there's also in the federal government, there's a shortage of skilled staff. And I took some quotes or notes from a NextGov analysis about the IT workforce in the federal government. And one of the things it talked about was a struggle to attract young workers. And why is that a struggle? It's for every 4.5 federal IT employees over the age of 60, there is only one under 30. So what does that mean? What problems does that cause? That means that there are a ton of federal IT employees that are approaching at or getting ready to be at retirement age. So when you only have one under 30 and you have that many over 60, how are you going to fill that gap? Some of the reasons for this, the government has to compete directly with the private sector, right? Because just like the government has new technology initiatives, so does the private sector. They need people that understand these new systems and technology. They're directly competing with the private sector, who often has deeper pockets than the federal government. Federal government has tightening budget. So if you have a tightening budget and you're expected to do more with less, not only does that affect your IT purchases and procurement, it affects your staffing. And then another thing that hurts the federal government when you talk about staffing or people that can manage these systems is the long cycle or hiring process within the federal government, especially if you're talking about a cleared resource, okay? So if you're in the federal government, you know how long it takes to get someone on site and cleared before they can even touch these systems. So we think that the as-a-service model can help address a lot of these problems. All right, now this is just a slide with a bunch of pictures, but I'm about to paint a story for you. So I had a customer, and they were looking at implementing a next-gen firewall. They were migrating from a Cisco ASA to the new Cisco next-gen firewall with firepower. Great product, but they were a little worried because they had only worked on ASAs, and how are they going to implement this with ICE, the rest of their systems, you know, for user and policy management, all this stuff that they were unfamiliar with. They wanted training. They wanted Cisco Advanced Services to come in, which Cisco Advanced Services is great, but sometimes they value their services very highly. That's all I'll say. So a familiar story, and I'm going to paint it for you. this is what the IT procurement process looks like right now, right? So this first picture over here, you have the gentleman with the computer. There is a need, the CIO pushes a need, there's a mandate, or there's a legacy system that is long in the tooth that you need to sunset. So you figure that out, and you move over to the next step, this graph here, do this detailed analysis, you finally select a product, and you get a budget approval. Now, in the federal government, budgets are approved yearly, and really the buying cycle starts in June, ends through September. So you get this funding, you find a vendor, find a partner to work with, whomever, someone like Diversified preferably, and then you procure it. So you procure it. This has already been a long process, okay? It's been a long process up through the need or analysis or generation of a need, then the analysis, then you get the funding, then you select a vendor, you go through the RFP process, you get 3 bids, you finally get it on site after it's shipped, and then your staff is like, whoa, this is a new product. So this is where the guy comes in with the apple. This is a new product I've never used before. You want me to implement it into our production environment? Well, I'm not going to do that until I'm for sure know it's ready. So that person either has to get trained, put in a test dev environment, and finally spin it up after this extremely long process to get to the finish line where the new IT purchase is now in their production environment. So the reason these next few slides are on here, seen some people talk about how, you know, on LinkedIn or out there on blogs, network as a service, is that really just like a unicorn of a term, or is that something people can actually deliver, or is it something that people actually want? So I took 3 slides from 3 different agencies, their IT modernization plan. The first one is from the VA IT modernization plan. And if you look at 8 right here, the last sentence, infrastructure needs to be enhanced to support all information systems under the mandate of reducing costs and moving capital expenditures to operating expenditures. And then they want improved infrastructure by introducing common services. We think that the as-a-service model checks marks both those boxes. Now this one's from the CDC. They want a robust IT infrastructure supporting public health. They want the globalization, 24/7 global presence, capability to adjust to real-time circumstances through an elastic, on-demand, scalable architecture and capability. If you're delivering as a service, that's much easier than if you have to go through that convoluted process we talked about a couple of slides back. And finally, the DoD IT modernization plan. They want to consolidate infrastructure. They want to move to the cloud. They want to standardize IT platforms, enable agile IT, strengthen IT governance, modernize IT guidance and training, improve enterprise architecture effectiveness, and strengthen IT investments. We think that as a service hits on every single one of those, and we can check mark all those boxes. So I've just talked a lot about the problem with the IT procurement process as we see it. What's the answer? The as-a-service model. And why is the as-a-service model the answer? Ability to move from CapEx to OpEx. Maybe you want to pay it monthly. Maybe you want to do a quarterly payment. Maybe you want to do a yearly payment. We have the ability to do all of that. Ability to get on a standardized life cycle refresh, right? So, you know, Moore's Law, that's still in effect. People want to retire or sunset their legacy IT infrastructure that's getting long in the tooth, but they want to be on a standardized life cycle refresh. As a service can do that. Predictable costs over a defined period of time, much like we talked about with enterprise agreements last week and licensing. If you get your hardware on an as-a-service model, you get volume discounts and you get a predictable cost over a defined period of time. And you lock in that pricing up front. So if pricing goes up in year 3 as opposed to year 1, you're locked in. Define service level agreements, all right? Customize SLAs to meet your enterprise or agency's need. This next one relates to the staffing issue. Industry experts supporting your infrastructure. Diversified has a plethora of IT experts around data center, route switch, wireless, security, unified communications, cloud. That's their job, to be experts at it. So let us help you in an area where you may be lacking. This is a big one. Next, ability to focus on key business drivers or agency initiatives, not break fix or not installing new products, right? No, the DoD's mission or mandates or agency mandates are not to install new switches, right? It is to protect the country. So it lets you focus on your agency's mission, not keeping the lights on for IT, and install managed services to ensure your systems go online in a timely manner. Instead of having that whole test dev environment, let Diversified spin up the systems for you. Let us test them, and then let us ensure that when you enter into your production environment that they're going to work flawlessly. So that's what we think the answer is, and that is all I have to say. I'm going to pass it over to Stephen Jenkins to let him talk about what the as-a-service model looks like at Diversified.
All right, fantastic, Zach, thanks. And before we pass it on to Stephen, I want to pause for a second and open up the mics for anyone that may have a question thus far. We do have one question in queue, Zach. I'll go ahead and read that one off here. You focused and talked a good bit about the lack of support within the federal government. Does Diversified have the ability to add staff augmentation to the as-a-service model in the event that we are short-staffed or need help?
If that is something you need, we definitely have that capability to add it into the cost structure for this. We would just need to understand, your specific agency clearances or requirements or needs and what that person would look like. So yes, that is definitely something that we can do here.
All right, fantastic. Well, Stephen, we'll pass it on to you then to talk about anything as a service at Diversified.
All right, thank you very much. So yeah, at Diversified, Zach has laid out a very clear understanding of there's a need and then there's an answer to that need, right? And we see that answer to the need as a service. And so as a service, it does always go back to the fact of the agency wants to concentrate on doing the mission, or the line of business wants to concentrate on the mission at hand, right? What they're tasked to do in their daily operation. And so as a service, we're providing that in a way that you can consume it, right? So at the end of the day, we're providing a service that you just consume and you don't think about it and you operate in a daily fashion. But we understand there's different ways that people want to consume that service from a financial standpoint and from a technology standpoint. So we try to be as flexible as possible when we're doing and crafting an as-a-service model for our clients. So we really want to focus on the needs at hand, right? So I think everything that Diversified does in the as-a-service model, it starts with a discussion. So that discussion kind of starts with, hey, let's figure out what your needs are. Let's figure out what you're trying to accomplish. Let's understand what the lines of business or the agency wants to do, right? We take that back and then we figure out from a technology perspective, what does the life cycle look like for that technology? What technology are we providing to achieve the solution, right? So we try not to provide service as a hardware, service as a solution at the end of the day. And so we want to focus on how do we create the solution across the board to achieve the business outcomes that you're looking to have. And then we can figure out on the financial side to figure out how you want to consume it from a CapEx, OpEx, yearly, quarterly, monthly basis, right? And then we can work that out over, numerous of terms. And so we're going to talk about that a little more with Gina here in a moment. But basically, we come down to the consulting phase into the implementation phase, and then we manage that for you over the course of time. A lot of times with this technology, it's changing at a fast pace, right? A lot of agencies are getting behind in technology because it's evolving, because it's growing. And so we build that into these plans, right, based on the technology that we're discussing. So we'll have a life cycle advisor program that's built into this so that we're doing an adoption rate. If it's a technology that you should be using, we would include adoption services as part of our as a service because you want to be sure that you're using it effectively. We also want to be sure that the business is getting the outcomes they want. So we also build in to our service the quarterly or it could be monthly business reviews to just kind of touch base with you, see how things are going, make sure that you're happy with the service, make sure that nothing is is unexpected happen so that we can optimize and tweak everything as we need, right? And then we also have other things that we can add into the service, which is a quarterly engineering review. So we're coming in and looking at the technology. We may see areas where there's an elevated ticket volume there, and so we'll look at that and discuss with you of how we can remediate and correct those issues. So it's an ongoing partnership we have with you to make sure that you're not only staying up on technology, but the technology there is providing the business outcomes that you're looking for. And then we will also work with you on a life cycle refresh program on the financing side of the as a service model to make sure that, if you're a 3-year or 5-year refresh, then we can build that into the plan so that you're always up to date on software, right? And we're always providing that technology roadmap for you. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Nathan, see if there's any questions.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Yes, mics are open if you have any questions about how Diversified approaches anything as a service. If there are none, we'll pass the mic on to Gina to talk about the finances of this a little bit, some of the challenges associated with anything as a service.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. And thanks, Stephen. So as Zach and Stephen have mentioned, agencies are facing increasing challenges as they look at all the various solution types that are shown on the slide. So some of the challenges they face are increasing complexity, budgets that aren't aligned with the increase in scope as a result of that increase in complexity. And on top of it, Zach highlighted this, the procurement process that isn't currently designed to maximize the buying power of the agency. So essentially a situation where each agency is being directed to do more with less resources and less budget dollars. So the objective of the next couple of slides is to discuss how to help the government understand the solutions that are currently available under the as-a-service model to help meet those increasing needs in the face of decreasing budgets and increasing complexities. One note to keep top of mind is that everything that we'll talk about and that we have talked about is FAR compliant, so completely compliant with the federal acquisition regulations. So as we look at the benefits, rather than read the bulleted benefits on the slide, I'll offer some commentary on the topic. To put it into perspective, what we're talking about with as a service, we'll consider a hardware purchase. Let's say the hardware has a useful life of 3 to 5 years. One way to think of the traditional acquisition approach of using current year CapEx to purchase that hardware is that the government is paying upfront for an item that's going to be used over many years. So what's happening is that the current year spending is not being aligned with the current needs and the current usage. Part of today's budget is being used to pay for the future needs. So the disadvantage to this approach is that there are other current year needs that are going unmet because there's only so much money to go around in the budget. The benefit of the as-a-service model is that there's much better alignment between what your needs are and the scarce resources, both from the human resources and the financial resources perspective. In the as-a-service model, using OpEx dollars is aligning the current year spending with the current year needs. And if you think about that hardware example, in the as-a-service model, instead of paying for all of that hardware up front, you're splitting up the cost over the time period in which that hardware is going to be used. For discussion purposes, we're going to take a look at an example of a solution that requires hardware, licensing, and professional service components. Zach and Stephen touched on solutions like this when they were going over their overviews. The top portion of the table shows the costs using the traditional acquisition on a one-year basis. The bottom portion shows costs using an as-a-service model. One point I'll call out in the as-a-service model, you'll see that in the top, it says year 1, year 2, year 3. In the as-a-service example, you'll see it says base year, option year 1, option year 2. That's a deliberate use because, as I mentioned earlier, the as-a-service solutions are FAR compliant. So it's recognized that as you go on a multi-year basis, those out years are subject to, of course, congressional appropriation, renewal of the options for the out years, and of course, T4C. So the main point of this slide is to highlight that portion in yellow. So when you look at the total cost of ownership, comparing a one-year acquisition and an as-a-service model acquisition, you'll see that if you're procuring on a one-year basis, traditional approach, it's about a $9.5 million total cost for that solution over the course of 3 years. In an as-a-service model, it's $9 million, about $500,500 difference. So what's driving that savings? A couple things, but the biggest driver is that piecemeal incremental acquisitions on a one-year basis don't qualify for multi-year or volume discounts from the vendors. As a result of buying on a one-year basis for that same solution, the government actually ends up paying a lot more than what it needs to get the same amount of hardware, licensing, and professional services. So on the flip side, your total cost on an as-a-service basis ends up being less expensive because the vendors can say, well, you know, you're buying more, you're signing up for more, we can offer you a lot steeper discounts. So we recognize that this might seem new and a big change to a traditional approach and the traditional ways of thinking. As you think about what you need to accomplish for the balance of this year, one piece of advice would be to consider projects that you have to accomplish that might be large, complex, with multiple components. It's those kinds of projects where the savings using an as-a-service model can be significant and where you really get a lot larger bang for your buck. And as you consider those projects, I really encourage you to reach out to Zach as a resource to think about your options because new ways of thinking are really the only way that the government is going to be able to accomplish everything that it needs to accomplish in the face of increasing complexity and shrinking budgets on an annual basis. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Nathan, and we can see what other questions we might have from the audience.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gina. We'll open up the mics now for anyone that has questions. We've got a couple in queue here, but I'll pause in case there's some live questions. So one of the first questions in queue is, how does Diversified do multi-year agreements with federal agencies when our budget is only allocated 1 year at a time and there's no guarantee of next year's funding? You touched on this, Gina, but maybe Zach, from the Diversified perspective, could take this one?
Yeah, I'm actually going to let Gina take this one because I think that's KeyBank's value here to the federal customer. So I'm going to let her reiterate it.
Sure. That's a great question. So as we looked at the example of the base year and the option year, so the way that the procurement mechanism by which you can do as a service is a couple different ways. You can issue the award on a base plus option year contract, so that can be a one-year base and multiple one-year options. That can be multi-year bases with one-year options. That can also be in the form of a master agreement with schedules underneath. So as additional needs come online, you can execute the schedules underneath that master. It also applies to any contract vehicle, whether that's GSA, SOUP, any of the other procurement vehicles, with whether or not if there's a set-aside inclusion. This concept is applicable across the board to any of the federal acquisition regulations.
Great. Gina, there's a related question for a little more information there. What agencies are using these type purchasing vehicles now?
I can tell you that all of them are. DISA, the Army, the Navy, VA, the intelligence community, CIA, FBI, Executive Office of the White House, the scientific community, NASA, the national laboratories, NNSA. There's pretty much in the 20 plus years that we have been providing solutions, financial solutions to agencies. We have had the pleasure of providing solutions to every branch of our federal government.
Okay, another question in the queue here. I'm not a federal end user. Does Diversified have the ability to monitor private sector network devices remotely as well?
Yeah, Nathan, I would say definitely that goes back to our 300,000 monitored endpoints, and we definitely have the ability to remotely manage network devices if you're one of those entities that doesn't have the strict regulations of the federal government.
Yep, and just to add to that, we absolutely do that today, and we can offer up the remote monitoring. And so they can be done in different ways, but essentially at the end of the day, it's a completely proactive service. So we will have metrics set up, and we can do that for you so that anytime something happens or a threshold is crossed, it would automatically signal a workflow on our side to remediate that as quickly as possible. So absolutely, we can provide that.
Fantastic. We got one last question here in the queue. And so, Zach, you mentioned, and this must be from a caller that was on last week, discussing the Cisco enterprise agreements. You mentioned a little bit, but can you explain more how an enterprise agreement would tie to the as-a-service model?
Yeah, so really the main goal of the as-a-service model is to help the federal government stretch their funds and get on a life cycle refresh. And if you were with us last week, you remember that you could do enterprise agreements in 1, 3, or 5-year terms, right? So you can do the same thing here with the network infrastructure. So imagine if you're on a 5-year network infrastructure as a service model with your enterprise agreement wrapped in at a 5-year term, and then you co-terminate both of those at the same date at the end of the 5-year term. You are now not only on a hardware lifecycle refresh, you are on a licensing lifecycle refresh. So it really just builds on the value of last week's webinar. Good question.
All right, the mics are open in case there are any other questions. If not, we've covered all the ones in the queue. If not, I just want to say thank you to Gina for joining us today and bringing the great information with you. We've always enjoyed partnering with you. Stephen, thanks for
Thank you, Nathan.
adjusting your day. Yes, of course. Thanks, Stephen, for you adjusting your day. I know you're in between and traveling, so appreciate you carving out the time. And a big thank you to Zach. This entire series was your brainchild, and for putting it together. We've had a lot of great content over the last 4 weeks. I'll remind everyone that the recordings are available out on YouTube and through social media. This one will be as well, and we look forward to catching up with you again in the future. If you have any questions beyond today, feel free to always reach out to Zach and or Brooke. Their emails are here, and I'll leave them up on the screen as we shut the series down. So thank you, everyone, for all that you've done, and we look forward to doing business with you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Nathan. Bye-bye.